All right. Looks like a lot of people are still joining, so I'll maybe wait 30 more seconds or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Awesome. Nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we have a lot of really good content today, so I think it will be best for us to get started, even though some folks are still trickling in. So I'll go slow here to get us started. So thank you all. Welcome to the webinar today. I'm joined by some amazing speakers, and I'm just going to give a quick intro on some logistics, and then we'll get into it. So thank you again for being here. Just as a quick reminder, the program is being recorded, and after the session, you will get a link so you can watch it again and or share it with your colleagues, and we will post it to the web as well. So if you miss something, just know that the conversation will be recorded. In order to ask questions, please use the Q&A function. You're welcome to also talk in the chat, but it will be much easier for us to monitor questions and make sure that you're getting adequate answers if you use the Q&A function. So please go ahead and just put your question in there. If you want to direct your question to a certain panelist, please go ahead and name them directly. That really helps us as well. You can also upvote questions. So if someone has a question that you also share, please feel free to update or upvote that question. During the presentation portion, you are on mute mode, and so you won't be able to speak right now. But if someone wants to explain more about a question, we can fix that later on. And I think with that, we will go ahead and get started. And I'll just mention again, thank you for being here. Excited to put on this webinar today. I'm Bridget Flynn with Second Nature. And we are putting on this webinar with Tradewater, which is a new Second Nature partner. We're really excited to be partnering with them. They're doing really amazing stuff with refrigerant management, destruction, and creating high quality offsets through the refrigerant destruction. And we have a really great example of that from two campuses today. So I'm joined by Jess Berry from Brown University and Matthew Arsenault from Duke University. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jess to get us started.
Great, thanks, Bridget. Oh, maybe Bridget, do you want to give intros to the team?
We'll have each other. You guys can introduce yourself so we can get started.
Okay,
I'm
great.
gonna highlight you here.
Okay, great. So I'm Jess Berry. I'm the AVP for Sustainability and Resiliency at Brown University. We are a very urban university, one of the first universities in the nation. So we have a building stock that is about 230 or so buildings, but you can imagine that they range from everything that dates back to the 1700s to built this to ones that were built this very summer, so or this past summer. So there's a wide range of buildings. There's a wide range of mechanical and infrastructure systems within those buildings, and in our quest to meet our net zero goals, which I'll talk about in a minute, there are a lot of moving parts, so to speak, and a lot of things to think about as we move towards our goals. We do have a primary heating source in Rhode Island and on the university as natural gas. We have backups, resiliency systems in place, which is fueled by oil. But for the most part, we're really looking at offsetting natural gas. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So we've had our greenhouse gas emission goals dating back to the mid 2000s, and those were set at the time. They were really aggressive, and it was to reduce our I'm sorry, it was to reduce our emissions by 42% by 2020. And as we came up to that 2020 mark, around 2018 or so, we really started to think about what our next endeavor is related to addressing our global climate crisis. And so we really looked very carefully at what the science was saying. We engaged several of our faculty members who are climate scientists to have discussions around what made sense for the university and how we could be most impactful. And the two goals that we set were net zero emissions through decarbonization by 2040. And a 75% emission reduction by 2025 based on a 2018 baseline. Now, the through decarbonization is really important to note here, because what that means is that we want fossil fuel burning equipment off campus. That is everything from our central heat plant to natural gas boilers, to fleet vehicles, to grounds equipment, and so forth. And so what this really meant, and it's stated very clearly in our strategic plan, is that we want to do this with minimal offsets. And obviously that there are things that cannot be substituted at this point with materials that don't cause climate change. And so, for example, you can think of laboratory gases, right? In order to run our research in laboratories, we need to use laboratory gases, air conditionings and refrigerants. And so those types of things don't have suitable replacements. So we realized that we are going to need to buy offsets in some capacity. And in order to meet our 75% emission reduction goal, the initial strategy was to take our central heat plant and to in some way replace the primary natural gas fuel with whether it's a biofuel or renewable natural gas that would get us to that 75% emission reduction. What we found was that there was really high risk and liability associated with those two options, and so we had to think about what our next step was. And so we started to look at what are it before we can reach our 2025 goal. How can we offset those emissions in the best possible way before we decarbonize our central heat plant? And what we came up with were refrigerant destruction offsets. And I'm just going to we'll go to the next slide so I can give a brief overview of where Brown stands in terms of our footprint and our path to net zero. And I'll give a brief overview of why we chose the refrigerant offsets over others. So you'll see on the left-hand side what our GHG scope looks like, our footprint. We really are almost a 50-50 split between our scope 1, which is fossil fuels on campus, and scope 2, which is purchased electricity. The purchased electricity was the easiest to tackle. We are currently 100% offsetting our electricity usage with renewable power purchase agreements for primarily solar, a little bit of wind. They are all of the solar is in state. We had very high standards for assessment in terms of everything from community engagement to environmental impact, to kind of understanding the risks associated with any particular array. The second, you'll see you'll see that it kind of grayed out on the right-hand side here. So we've tackled our scope 2. The scope 1 was the carbon. You'll see where carbon offsets fit in, and that's getting us to reach our 2025 goal. And then the remaining scope 1 is kind of sitting out there until we fully decarbonize our scope 1. And when I say fully decarbonize, I mean probably around 99%. We still need resiliency. We still need laboratory gases and so forth. And so when we decided to do, so you'll see our phase one right here was to secure power purchase agreements for renewables. Phase two was to secure 10 years of these offsets to reach our 2025 goal. And we went through a really intense process of understanding how to choose which offsets to move forward with. And we engaged a consulting firm that we've been working with on our PPAs and other projects. They're now called Coho. And they really walked us through a variety of offset options. We had faculty, climate change faculty that specialized in carbon offsets sitting at the table. We had people from our operations staff sitting from our table, and from our budget and finance division and so forth. And so one of the, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later about, the criteria for refrigerant offsets, and why we went with Tradewater, because they ticked all of those boxes, including additionality, permanent, they were verified. And I'm not going to go into those, the specific details on those, because we'll go into those shortly. But those are really the key components to why we chose those. And then, as I said, full campus decarbonization is going to be our last phase here. Next slide. I think this moves over to Duke.
All right, thanks, Jess. So as was mentioned, my name is Matt Arsenault. I'm an assistant director in Duke Sustainability Office. Been with the office for around 7 years now, and actually for the first 5 or so years managed the university's carbon offsetting program. Still do that, but I do other things now too. And so a very quick background on Duke's carbon neutrality pledge. This is a Second Nature carbon neutrality goal, started as an ACU PCC goal that we made in 2007. We set a goal for ourselves at that time for 2024. If you look at your calendars, you'll see that we are pretty darn close. It's based on a fiscal year, and so we've got about a month left in fiscal year 2024. It includes scopes 1, 2, and 3. Again, if you're familiar with Second Nature, if you're on this webinar, you likely know what we're counting. We do include some other scope 3 emissions that we've sort of added over the years, including transmission losses, fugitive emissions, and refrigerants. So Duke making this, what we feel like is a pretty ambitious carbon neutrality goal back in 2007, was also, I think, ambitious in its approach to carbon offsets by making this sort of staffed office to explore carbon offsets in 2009, which I think at the time was sort of the only thing like that existed in higher ed, full-time staff dedicated to carbon offsets. And so over the years, our predecessors have developed their own carbon offset projects. We've been more recently trying to be savvy market operators when it comes to evaluating specific projects and purchasing decent quantities of offsets. We've worked with students countless times to sort of explore the market with them and bring them along with us in our process. Worked with Meredith on the offset network to sort of peer verify offset projects, have our developed projects peer verified by other institutions. And so we've been involved with carbon offsets intimately since 2009 and have learned a lot along the way. If we could go to the next slide. So the way that we're going to achieve our carbon neutrality goal is through this sort of reduce, renew, offset approach, where we really prioritize on-campus reductions. These are the sorts of things that we have dedicated the most time, effort, and money to, really tangibly reducing our own emissions here in Durham. So one example is that even though our campus has grown in terms of population and square footage that's heated and cooled by a decent clip, we've still reduced our emissions, our energy emissions by 40% in that same time. The renew part of this is in a very difficult environment, I'll add. We live in a regulated energy market here in North Carolina. So our options to buy solar a couple of years ago didn't exist, more or less. Luckily, the North Carolina General Assembly created a program that allowed institutions like Duke to do a one-time purchase of solar from a third party. And so we maxed out our capacity legally allowed under that program to invest in 101 megawatts of solar. We would love to do more of that, but like I said, regulated energy market, we are really limited in what we're able to do as far as it relates to procuring renewable energy. And then finally, once we've sort of exhausted our efforts in the first two categories, we look at carbon offsets to address the residual emissions, which we have done over the last year or two and are on the precipice of retiring them to make our carbon neutrality goal real. So on the next slide, I talk about our evaluation process. And so our carbon offsets office, we did have a pivot, and I don't remember exactly when this was. I'd have to guess, oh gosh, right around 2020, 2021, where we originally thought we were going to make all of our own carbon offsets. We were not even going to need external project developers. And then as we had these cumulative years of experience of developing projects and attempting to develop projects, we're sort of met with this uncomfortable reality that a two-person office in a sustainability office at a university is probably not going to be able to match the scale of a carbon offset development firm with many more times the staff and many more years of expertise. And so then we had this big pivot to the market where we realized we're going to have to be buying some of our carbon offsets, if not a majority of them, and started to have this crisis of confidence where we really came to understand the problems that were really prevalent in the voluntary carbon market. And once we realized that the depth of these problems, we wanted to get very serious about our evaluation process for the carbon offsets that we were going to acquire. And so this is a very high level of what our process looks like. We will solicit project proposals. We'll use as our first sort of evaluation step here in step 2, we'll run it through our scoring matrix, which is something we developed with Ruby Canyon, who's a third-party verifier. So Emma and I will run it through our scoring tool. Anything that gets past that, which is a shockingly small percentage of projects, will go on to our faculty advisory committee. Anything that gets through that will be brought to an executive committee, and anything that makes it all the way through will be recommended for final purchase. The number of projects that have done this are in the single digits, and I think less than 7 projects of the many, many, many that we've reviewed have actually gone through this process successfully. And so on the final slide, I've got a screenshot of about a fifth of our evaluation tool, fifth or a sixth of our evaluation tool, just to give a flavor of sort of what it is that we use when we're evaluating these projects in our first pass. So the way we developed this was contacting Ruby Canyon again. We had seen their name everywhere in the voluntary market, know that they have a really stellar reputation, and said, hey, lend us some of your expertise. Let's put our heads together and let's instill sort of Duke values in a tool, pairing our expertise in the carbon market to have something that helps us evaluate these projects. And so all of this to say, we have what we feel is a pretty rigorous carbon offset evaluation process. Very, very, very few projects. I mean, our pass rate is lower than 10%. And of our 7 projects that we've purchased, 2 of them are Tradewater projects. So I hope those numbers speak for themselves. And we're big fans of the work that Tradewater does, and are happy to talk more about them.
Hey, I think this is me, Bridget. Just to take a minute to talk about, so thank you so much for the overview, Jess and Matt. It's so impressive to hear the work that y'all are involved in. I'm always amazed at all the complex and hard stuff that our campuses are doing. I'm Meredith Lee. I'm with Second Nature. I'm climate programs manager and formerly was the carbon offset fellow. So I've spent a lot of time also thinking about offsets, studying offsets, researching them. I've learned a lot from Matt and worked a lot with Matt as one of our members and executive committee member of the Offset Network. And so we just wanted to have a quick moment to talk about the just sort of what makes offsets high quality and the kind of standards that we have adopted at Second Nature for helping us talk to campuses about carbon offset integrity. And so the first bullet here that you'll see is probably something that you're hearing a lot lately if you're thinking about offsets at all, and that's the core carbon principles. And so these are, all the principles are listed in the dark blue box there on the slide. And we won't be going through each one of them independently because it's obviously quite complex. But this is an attempt by a multi-stakeholder, market body of players, the ICVCM, to create a standard for what creates high integrity carbon offsets. And members of Second Nature might be familiar with another acronym, PAVER, which stands for Permanence, Additionality, Verifiability, Enforceability, and Real. And actually, the PAVER qualities of carbon offsets actually can be mapped to the core carbon principles. So we and in our forthcoming guidance, we kind of map them to the core carbon principles so that schools working with either PAVER or CCP or both can sort of be able to articulate how the offsets that they're working with fit into both PAVER requirements and the core carbon principles. And then on top of that, we also recommend that schools look very closely at the climate justice indicators of carbon offset projects. And while many offset registries are incorporating sustainable development goals, or like at least 3, and I think Plan Vivo requires up to 6 as part of their projects, the SDGs aren't all encompassing of some of the equity concerns that come along with carbon offsets. We're working with the UC Center for Climate Justice on an add-on standard called the Climate Justice Standard, and we're very excited to provide more information about that in the future. But we're definitely very interested in schools taking a vested interest in the equity considerations of projects and making sure that the co-benefits are, encompassing of the interests of Indigenous peoples and local communities specifically. And then co-benefits beyond those social, safeguards. Obviously, we're very interested in our schools pursuing projects that have educational co-benefits, research co-benefits, and that schools can use their research enterprise and workforce development assets to actually engage in the projects. As Matt mentioned at Duke, getting students involved in project evaluation or project development. And as Jess mentioned, getting faculty involved with project vetting. Those are some of the ways that higher education is playing a role in developing integrity in the market. And so we just wanted to provide a quick moment to say, some of the intros to offset integrity. And I think with that, we're turning it over to Eli, who's going to be talking about some of those integrity measures more specifically.
Yes, thank you, Meredith, for kind of grounding us in those principles. I'm Eli Etzioni. I manage partnerships at Tradewater and wanted to just briefly give the very quickest overview of what we do. We are a certified B Corporation. We are refrigerant experts, and we do projects that prevent greenhouse gas emissions and generate carbon credits as a result of that work. We're specifically focused on reducing emissions from extremely potent non-CO2 gases. So the canisters that you see in both the photos on this slide contain old generations of refrigerants that deplete the ozone layer and are orders of magnitude more potent than CO2 at warming the planet, up to 10,000 times more potent than CO2 on a pound-for-pound basis. These refrigerants were banned from production multiple decades ago, but there are still large amounts of this gas out there all over the world. And you can think of Tradewater as a company on a global scavenger hunt to find this gas wherever it resides and permanently destroy it before it leaks. Next slide, please. To just briefly illustrate some of the offset integrity principles that Meredith laid out, we thought it would be helpful to look at an actual Tradewater project and also help you get to know us just a little bit better. This is a photo from our warehouse in the US. Last year, we completed a project on the American Carbon Registry in the United States called US ODS 3, where we actually purchased small canisters of refrigerant from individual people all over the country, tested and measured all that gas, and permanently destroyed it. Next slide, please. So here are just a few of the kind of quality checks and integrity principles Meredith laid out applied to our US ODS 3 project. The first is accuracy. So for accuracy, the questions you're going to want to be asking of any project are essentially, how is the emissions reduction or removal measured, and how is the impact of the project calculated off of those measurements? In the case of our project, we sampled every single cylinder for the quantity and the type of gas in it when we got it, and then added up and measured the amount of gas total before destroying it. For the global warming potential values for each of the gases we destroyed, we pulled those directly from an IPCC Intergovernmental Climate Report. Next, please. The next one is additionality. I know this is particularly important to some of the folks on the call. And the question here is essentially, is there a chance the project would have occurred without revenue from carbon credits? If the answer is yes, we have a problem. But if the answer is no, we're in good shape. With our work destroying these refrigerants, there's no regulation in the United States that requires us to destroy these gases. And in absence of the funding from carbon credits, there's no business case, no payout, no financial incentive for destroying them. So we check the box very clearly on additionality. The next one is permanence, also super important. And the questions to ask here are, how long will the CO2 or CO2 equivalent that was avoided or removed be kept out of the atmosphere? And is there any risk of reversal of that impact? In our case, we're actually superheating these refrigerants and breaking them down into their component parts, salt, a very small amount of CO2, and water. And that's a process that can't be undone. So we don't have permanence or reversal concerns with this kind of project. Next is the concept of leakage, which is a little bit wonkier in the carbon world, but essentially the question here is, does the decrease in emissions that we create by doing this project somehow cause an increase in emissions somewhere else? And in the case of our work, because we're finding and destroying gases that are no longer produced anywhere, there's no concern or risk that by destroying them, we're going to create some sort of vacuum that would incentivize additional production, because additional production is no longer happening anywhere. And lastly, co-benefits. In taking these canisters off people's hands and disposing of this gas, we're removing a hazardous, leaky item. We're also channeling funding and finance directly into communities and to people. And we're slowing and continuing to prevent destruction of the ozone layer as it is gradually recovering. And just one more sentence, Bridget, if you can go back. I just wanted to underscore transparency. What I shared here is just the tip of the iceberg. We love it when campuses and partners and collaborators ask us more questions. So this is only the beginning of what there is here.
Bridget, I believe
we're
that's my slide, which we're going to address in the panel.
Yeah, I think we can hand it back to Meredith and the panelists for open discussion.
Great. So yeah, that was a good introduction, and please continue to put your questions in the chat. We do have some good ones. I see Matt is working to address one of the ones in there, but we do have a question related to this, Susan. So hopefully you will get your question answered. And so I wanted to start out, Jess and Matt, by asking each of you just kind of how Tradewater came up in your approaches. You both did a really good job of telling us kind of how you went about procuring different offset options, but it would be interesting to hear like how Tradewater came up for you, and then sort of like what was the process of working with them like how did they accommodate your questions and needs? Why don't we hear from Matt first?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. So our process of coming to work with Tradewater was sort of what I mentioned before. We pivoted to the market. We were feeling somewhat distressed about the state of the voluntary carbon market and the relatively low quality of your average project on the market. And we sort of were asking ourselves, okay, you know, asking for individual projects proposals is not resulting in a lot of success for us. What can we do? Should we find a project type that maybe we feel is pretty high quality, and then maybe find a company that offers good examples of that project type? So we landed on ODS Destruction as sort of our, maybe probably our number one, but at least a project that we thought, hey, this project as an entire type across the board seems to have less problems, at least, than other projects, certainly. And we said, okay, let's explore this some more. Let's find companies that offer credits from these types of projects, and really dive deep into the details of those individual projects and see where we land. So that's basically our process. That's how we arrived at Tradewater. We looked at a couple of their competitors and found through our process of dealing with Tradewater, we found them to be so transparent. Our first initial couple of conversations with them were so wonderful. They, you know, went so far above and beyond just offering to sell us a product. Jenny Morgan from Tradewater is wonderful to work with. She was offering internship programs and different ways that faculty and students could be involved, and really know how to speak the language of a university employee. And so, and they were sincere about it too, I should add. It did not, you know, wasn't a sales pitch at all. So we have found with other firms that we've purchased offsets from, they very much did not appreciate the specificity and the little weird things about working with a university that makes them different from working with a big corporate, for example. Tradewater was very adaptable and very understanding of the eccentricities of working with a university, not only understanding but embracing of these differences. And so that made us even more comfortable. And it doesn't hurt that the product that they're selling, these ODS credits, we thought were sort of the best that we had seen. So it really came together in this nice way and made the choice pretty obvious with us that we should buy these credits from them.
Jess, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I would kind of echo what Matt is saying. You know, we went into this with we were kind of agnostic in terms of the company, but we had our criteria, and you know, Matt showed his evaluation criteria. We had something very similar. It reflected a lot of what we talked about earlier in terms of additionality, permanence, transparency, verified offsets, and so forth. And we went out to bid and got a variety of different types of offsets presented to us. And we went through that process internally with the internal stakeholders that I mentioned, and had really deep conversations about what made sense from a financial standpoint, from a ethical standpoint, from a climate standpoint. And what came to light is that Tradewater their offsets ticked all of the boxes that we were looking for. There was further transparency, which we really appreciated, that any new projects that would be attributed to Brown's offsets would be, oh, I should mention this, is that our agreement was to invest financially upfront with Tradewater so that they could go out and get new offsets. We wanted to provide kind of extra additionality almost, where we were able to front them the payment so they could go out and get offsets that otherwise would have been postponed or later on or never approached by anybody. And so one of the key transparency pieces to that is that Tradewater agreed to, before they chose projects for Brown's offsets to be attributed to, is that they would provide us a kind of a white paper on those projects that we could review and ensure continue to meet our criteria, that we could review and then, you know, kind of sign off on. And so there was just kind of these layers of transparency, and also you know, they were just really high quality offsets, and financially approachable. And I know somebody in the questions has asked about our annual budget for offsets. As I'm sure you can understand, I can't share that or how much we paid, because those are kind of negotiated rates with you know, two organizations. But I will say that the Tradewater offsets were very competitive within the offset market.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think so this kind of gets to the initial question that was in the chat, like, and maybe we'll have time a little bit for you guys, Jess and Matt, to share like what were some of your initial questions for Tradewater, and the fact that you already had a robust, you know, evaluation framework, Matt, and the fact that you just had, you know, faculty that knew the right questions to ask, or potentially already knew the answers to some of the questions that other people might have. You know, there are universities out there that maybe don't have those resources, or aren't starting with a strategy or evaluation framework, or even a multi-stakeholder committee to help their sustainability departments with this vetting process. And so wondering if either of you have advice for schools that are facing that kind of a bottleneck when it comes to evaluating and sort of procurement and evaluation of high quality offsets.
Matt, why don't you go?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I want to acknowledge, you know, I feel really lucky at Duke. We have been afforded these resources. And I know that's not the case at most universities. And so just want to, you know, make sure I'm acknowledging that. With that said, I do think that if you don't have a staff person or two that focuses on offsets like we're lucky enough to have, I think leaning into the collaborative nature of higher ed is really going to work for you. I can't tell you, I literally can't. There have been so many conversations that I've had with other universities sharing what we've learned over the years, and they're really gratifying conversations. I look forward to them. And then probably an equal number of conversations where I've learned a lot about offsets through talking to sort of colleagues and peers at other universities. And so lean into that. Email me if you want to talk to me. I'm so happy to share what I've learned working in the offset market in higher ed. And so I'll say that is definitely something that you can embrace, is sort of, you know, share this burden with others. You're definitely not the only one in your position. And I'll also say there are some publicly available resources. In Meredith's slide, she mentioned the core carbon principles. So this is sort of the market kind of trying to correct itself. This is a positive sign. You know, you may or may not want to put 100% optimism in it, but at least the market has realized that there are problems that people have identified, and they are doing some work on them. I also want to point out, you know, there are these offset ratings firms that have come to the fore. They are expensive to have an annual subscription, but I will mention one, B0, has publicly available ratings. So you can literally go to their website and look at the letter grade that they've provided to offset projects. Another publicly available resource is the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, which I think is it's this full review methodology that's publicly available. It was developed by EDF and other nonprofit partners. And so, you know, collaborating with other universities, using these publicly available resources, even if you don't have a dedicated office or the money to hire a consultant, I still think that there are resources that you can put together to have success in the offset market. And if you think talking to me or anyone in my office will be part of that, please don't hesitate to reach out. Like I said, we're always happy to talk offsets.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also echo that what Matt says is that one of the things is that, you know, in recognition that I think somebody mentioned this in the questions about, you know, we're both Ivy League schools. We have endowments, we have resources, so we do recognize that. But one of the collaborations that we have being Ivies is that not only in recognizing that, but we understand that there's a responsibility in taking what we've learned because of those resources that we've had and sharing them with kind of our greater the greater higher education community. So that's why we do, you know, it's very key for us to do webinars or kind of present at ASHE or other forum. But like, for example, if somebody were to be interested in our criteria evaluation, that would be free and open. You know, I mean, these are things that, yes, we paid for, but in our grander consulting world, but that's something that we have that we want to share so that we can move the needle with other institutions on kind of solving our climate crisis collectively. And that goes not just for offsets, but it goes for everything from decarbonization to power purchase agreements to healthy materials in buildings and so forth. So to Matt's point, really leaning in and realizing that people are very open, institutions are very open to sharing knowledge.
Totally. Thank you both for that and for your generosity. And shameless plug for Second Nature. This is literally why we exist, to help schools share with each other and to create containers for that sharing to be most effective. And not just with respect to offsets, but with respect to decarbonization and renewable resources, to your point, Sue. So yeah, lean all the way in, please. You're more than welcome. And we have an offsets advisory council. We have several other working groups that are focused on campuses being on this journey together. And as we all know, doing something together certainly makes it easier than doing it by yourself, and also shows leadership who may not otherwise be supportive that this is the way to go. And so, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, join the advisory council, please. We would be more than happy to have you. I think the other aspect, and I know that there are a lot of questions for Tradewater, so I do think that we need to like turn it specifically to refrigerant management and refrigerant destruction. And one of the things that we were so excited about when we first heard about the collaboration between Brown and Tradewater is that just not only are y'all purchasing and procuring offsets through Tradewater, but you're actually partnering with them to destroy ODS in your campus operations. And so would you please tell us a little bit more about that journey and what, like, why you decided to do it, what the heck it is, and how it differs from what would happen through business as usual processes?
Yeah, sure. So we had a project come up on campus. It was a data center. It was it required updates to its fire suppression system. And the existing Halon 1301, I think it is, it could not be modified. And we needed to, Halon 1301 is a very potent greenhouse gas. And we had kind of two options, is that within the project, we could let the project design construction team take that off campus and do with it what they will, which would be likely selling it on the market because it's no longer able to be produced. And that would put it back into the world for use and presumably eventually leaking into the atmosphere. Or we could take responsibility for the materials on our campus and we could destroy it. And lo and behold, we already had a relationship with Tradewater. So we reached out and we said, hey, like, we know you guys do this all over the world, but is this something that you would consider doing, coming to campus and helping us kind of manage, remove, and destroy this this gas that we're going to need to deal with under a project. It came out to be about 300 pounds, which of gas, which will equate to about 830 carbon credits, which is substantial. And so, you know, it's important to understand that there is a cost associated with this that originally is not built into the project. And so we're talking, you know, somewhere around, you know, $10,000 to $20,000 additional cost. And while we recognize that, you know, for Brown, that's, you know, that kind of money when you're doing a very large project, or I shouldn't say very large, a large project, is not, you know, yes, it's, you know, we think about it and we question it, but it's also not as cumbersome as for, you know, other organizations or institutions. And so, but what I urge folks to think about is that when we start talking about this type of work and start taking responsibility for sustainability on our campuses and the cost associated with it, we do this with a lot of different things on campus, right? We do this when codes are updated across our cities and states, and we're required to do those things. We do this with diversity and inclusion, right? We have entire systems around campuses that were never in place before around diversity and inclusion, which is amazing. And there's so many resources and inputs going into diversity and inclusion, which is so important. And we need to think about sustainability in that same way, is that these are local, regional, and global issues that if organizations at our, you know, like higher institutions don't start setting standards around, then we're not going to be moving the needle. And so we really are going to, what we're trying to do, and this is an example of it, is trying to embed these sustainability standards into our kind of building and operational standards. And that's what, once you start to do that, then it's kind of like it's not a question mark anymore. It's just where there's a project, just the same as they choose energy efficient systems because it's up to code, then they are choosing to destroy on-site refrigerants, or they're choosing to put in electric heat pumps as opposed to natural gas boilers and so forth. So that's kind of how we think about it.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Jess. And I think, Ray, I think it's time for you to tell us a little bit more about how destruction happens and what are the options there, both kind of what you're doing with Brown, as well as like the full suite of options that Tradewater offers in terms of destruction.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for the time. Bridget, would you mind tossing my slide up? I think it's number 15. So in addition to selling offset credits, Tradewater develops the projects that generate these credits. And this is where there's an interesting opportunity for campuses, not just to purchase offsets from Tradewater, but to work with us to source your material at the end of its life. One thing I noted, Jess spoke about how we're recovering halons from Brown. I realize we haven't spoken about that much, but in addition to refrigerants, we also work with halons, which are a fire suppressant system. They're in a lot of libraries, data centers, special collections type places. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of universities have them on campus. But our basic theory here is that universities and colleges, you have large volumes of refrigerant under your control. The older these systems where the refrigerant is, the more it leaks. And as it leaks, it releases these greenhouse gases into the air. So as I said, in addition to purchasing credits from Tradewater, we can also work with you to, as you convert to newer systems, either because an air conditioning system has reached the end of its life, or you're upgrading it to a lower GWP model, you have two options when that gas comes out. You can sell it to a recycler, they're called reclaimers in the refrigerant world, who will clean it up and put it into someone else's old leaky equipment, where that material will continue to leak into the atmosphere, both from the equipment's standard leak rates, at the transfer times, or in the reclaiming process. Or when you recover that material, you can see that it is destroyed. And this is a service that Tradewater offers. So we can work with any sort of organization, but here specifically universities, to take the refrigerant at the end of its life, We handle the verification, we handle the destruction projects, and the issuing of the resulting carbon offset credits or the climate benefits. And that's all at no cost. We do all of that at no cost. So I've been reading the questions, and quite understandably, I see there's questions and concerns around the cost of all of this. This is one way that Tradewater can work with you where it's at zero cost to the university, is to recover your refrigerant as it comes out of systems, and we will see that it is destroyed. Now, in that process, there's two choices of what we can do, and this depends a little bit on what type of material we're working with. I'm going to try not to get too much into the weeds. But in many cases, we could purchase that material from you for cash. So it could become a cash positive project for the university. We'll buy the material from you as it comes out of the system. Now, in that case, you couldn't claim the carbon benefit towards a net zero goal because we'll be placing that carbon benefit with another buyer in the voluntary market. However, you could tell the story of what you're doing. You're still making the right decision to say that this refrigerant is destroyed, and it's still a great story you can communicate to your stakeholders. If you're interested in the carbon offsets that result from that destruction, kind of similar to how Brown is and Jess just spoke to, what we can do is we can return to you the offsets that result from the destruction of your material at the end of the process that you can use towards your net zero goals or any other sustainability commitments you have. In that case, we do charge $19 per credit per ton, but that's only in the scenarios if and when we return the credits to you at the end of the process for you to use. So that's kind of just one more thing I'll say. There's 4 steps to how we generally run this process. It's relatively straightforward. We start with an inventory of what material you have under your control at your university. What are your cooling systems? What type of refrigerant does it have? Second, we match that up with your capital expenditure program. So we look through and see, when is the system due to be replaced? When is this going to be decommissioned? When is it going to be upgraded? And that's how we identify good material for destruction. Third, we handle recovering the material from your university. We get it from your school. We bring it back to our warehouse in Chicago, where we weigh it, sample it, and aggregate it for a project. And then 4, we destroy it, and we either place the benefit with a buyer in the voluntary market, in which case we pay you for the material, or we return the credits back to you, in which case you pay us $19 per ton. So that's a kind of a quick overview of what our refrigerant services offerings are. Happy to, please reach out to me if you'd like to discuss it more, or I think we have some questions some more minutes I can field questions, but Meredith, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Ray. That was a really efficient overview of a very complicated process. So we appreciate it. And I encourage the webinar participants to actually click into the Q&A panel, even if you don't have a question. There have been many questions answered just via like a chat function. So questions about like where the incineration facilities are located and what happens to the tanks if this isn't. So some of those like, essential, details questions about Tradewater's work have been answered. If there are other questions, I think we have another like 5 minutes or so to take questions from the audience. And I'm sure that y'all have a lot of curiosities. And if not, there are some questions about like for Jess and Matt about like where your support came from. Like a lot of campuses are having trouble getting support for funding carbon offsets if we're looking into this type of stuff. So while we're waiting for those questions, I wonder if one of the two of you want to speak to, is your president a champion of this? So it's real easy for you, or how did you drum up support for doing this kind of work?
Yeah, that's always a question that I get, and I really want to. I'll start by saying we have a president that she is really invested in sustainability and doing the right thing, but she also has, as you can imagine, as all of our presidents do, thousands of other competing needs, right? So one of the things that we did was we really leveraged faculty that were passionate about this, a decarbonizing campus, and we leveraged the students. And we started to work with them to have conversations with senior leadership at the provost level, at the departmental level, at academic departmental level, at the presidential level. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in higher education that has experienced this, but as staff, we can say things over and over again and really push for things, but things can really be kind of heard more loudly when faculty and students raise their voice. And so I really encourage folks to think about where their champions are in the faculty and student world. But 100%, if you don't have senior leadership that is remotely interested in sustainability, this is going to be incredibly hard. And it might just take waiting it out until a change in leadership. I've seen that have to happen before. And that's a shame, but that's what we all deal with when it comes to working in higher ed. Matt?
Yeah, I just typed an answer to one of Susan's questions, but I want to touch on it. Our EVP, who I report to at the end of the day, came in and sort of inherited this 2024 carbon neutrality goal. And I think to his credit, he sort of embraced it despite his surprise and distaste for certain aspects of carbon offsets and how much they cost. But overcame those and fully embraced our 2024 carbon neutrality goal. Like I said, I think he deserves credit for doing that with a goal he could have changed but embraced. But to Susan's questions about these differences in institutional resources, I think it's a conversation worth having and acknowledging. I also want to mention, Susan, I'm almost positive you know Alex French, who has been an invaluable resource to our Offset Network Committee for years and years and years, and hope he's doing well at Climate Action Reserve. I do think that for smaller universities and colleges that, maybe the reduce, renew, offset sort of paradigm isn't the right fit. Maybe universities, the biggest impact we can have is not reducing our campus's emissions. It's our core educational mission and the future climate leaders we send into the world. That's the biggest impact universities have, in my opinion. And so sort of leaning into that, and maybe for like a community college or smaller university, not worrying so much about sort of achieving technical net zero, doing what you can, obviously, what you can afford, what your resources will allow, and what your administration will allow, but realizing and acknowledging that's not the biggest impact that universities have. It's not the role we necessarily play in society, or the main one at least. The main one is educating and influencing the next generation of people, which is so incredibly powerful. Much more powerful than any numbers on a spreadsheet that I have representing Duke's emissions, for example.
Yeah, I would really, that was really well said, Matt. I think that realizing that you can make climate impact without credits is huge. You can even have a mass, depending on where you are, you can have really substantial financial gains. When you think about renewable power purchase agreements, if your state has a virtual net metering legislation where you can pretty much kind of offset your electricity usage while making big dents, if not zeroing out your electric bills, right? Your utility bills. And if you choose not to keep those renewable energy credits, you can go out and sell them on the market and make more money off of that. So it can be a money-making or a financially positive experience. Now, yeah, if you're going to renovate all your buildings and electrify them, that is going to cost money. But also think about how you have to build in your carbon reduction or elimination desires into things like renewal. We all have to renew our buildings. All of our boilers have a life expectancy, and the market is moving in a place where gas and electric equipment are starting to kind of even out a bit in terms of cost. And at some point, I'm fairly confident that the cost of electric equipment, based equipment, heating and cooling equipment is going to flip. And that's going to be kind of the market norm. We're seeing that in a lot of places in terms of heating and cooling equipment. That trend, we're seeing it in healthy materials in buildings as well. So just starting to think about where you can plug those into and not necessarily, as Matt said, thinking that you have to have some like officially verified GHG emissions footprint to be making an impact.
Thanks to both of you for that. These can be such difficult conversations to have across contexts, but I think, you know, we really do want to highlight the good work that Tradewater's doing and the good work that y'all are doing with Tradewater. So I do want to bring it back, and we're going to go like maybe an extra 5 more minutes because we have had some really salient questions about HFCs, which are a different class of gases that I've learned about from our partnership with Tradewater. And so I'm excited to turn it back over to Ray to just give us a little bit more detail about like what's the deal with HFCs and what do you guys do with them?
Great questions. So I tried to type this as succinctly as I could into some of the typed questions, but HFCs are relevant because that is the generation of refrigeration material that's currently being used. So CFCs were the old stuff that was just depleting the ozone layer and in cans of hairspray. HCFCs, i.e. R22, it's kind of a middle generation that has been phased out. HFCs are what's being used most currently, and they are currently being phased out. So by 2035, HFC production will be phased down to, I believe, 85%, might be 90%, but HFC destruction will be phased out entirely. Many schools run HFCs because, like I said, they're what's being currently installed. There is not a methodology currently available for HFC destruction to generate carbon offset credits. We expect one to be published in the next 2 to 3 years, but there's still quite some debate about when can we definitively speak to the additionality of the work. So until they're phased down a little bit further, they're not eligible for their destruction are not eligible for carbon offset credits. However, they still have a very high global warming potential, and we can quantify the environmental benefit that is created from their destruction. If we know how the quantity of HFCs that we're destroying, and we know what the global warming potential of it is, both things are which are completely knowable, then we can, after destruction, we can say, look, we destroyed X tons of global warming potential. Where this gets tricky is that because they cannot be turned into carbon credits, it's rather difficult for us to find a buyer for this sort of carbon benefit in the voluntary carbon market. So if a school is interested in HFC destruction, we're more than happy to work with you, and we would run it just like any other project. It still gets weighed and sampled and tested, and it goes through a third-party independent verifier. However, the organization would have to commit upfront to buying the resulting off-registry carbon benefit at the end, because we cannot be confident in placing this in the voluntary market like we can a carbon credit. The other wrinkle here is because of that HFC material, we cannot purchase for cash like we could CFCs or HCFCs. Those I'll buy them from you for cash. HFCs, we cannot buy from cash. We can destroy them, but the school has to be committed to buying the resulting carbon benefit at the end of the process. I hope that answered the question. I know it's it's kind of weedy, but feel free to contact me directly if anybody would like to discuss this further.
Thanks, Ray. It's definitely a learning curve when it comes to these gases, and we appreciate, you know, Tradewater helping Second Nature kind of make those distinctions for our Solution Center and also for our forthcoming guidance. So there will be some more information coming out for our members and folks in our network about HFCs, HCFCs, refrigerant destruction, et cetera, that we've co-developed with Tradewater. So I'm not seeing a lot of other questions. Bridget, did you want to offer any parting words before we wrap up? And certainly we want to thank all the panelists, Eli and Ray from Tradewater, Jess from Brown, and Matt from Duke. Thank you guys so much.
And you, Meredith, from Second Nature. So thank you so much. Yeah, thank you all for coming. As I mentioned, we have recorded this, so if anything was missed, please feel free to watch this back or share with your colleagues who may be interested in this very exciting topic of refrigerant management and ODS destruction and high quality carbon offsets. And please don't hesitate to reach out to our colleagues, Eli and Ray at Tradewater. They have really been such a resource to us. And yeah, are just so knowledgeable. I feel like we walked into this process knowing very little and now are learning more and more. So please do reach out to them. They've been, yeah, just phenomenal resources. And obviously, Jess and Matt, thank you so much for your generosity in sharing what you've learned from your campuses and being able to try to equip others to be able to make similar decisions on their campuses. And I really appreciate also all of the attendees for joining, and thank you for your amazing questions, and also for the questions that help us push the envelope in terms of thinking about equity, especially, and less resourced institutions. And I will say that that's something Second Nature thinks about all the time, since we do have campuses all over North America that have a variety of resources and constraints. So just want to mention that as we're thinking about leaders in climate action, we think about all kinds of campuses and are really excited about the forthcoming Commitments 3.0 kind of guidance that will really allow many different kinds of campuses to shine in terms of the actions that they're taking and the ways that they're equipping their communities. So just wanted to say thank you for offering those. I think I've left the emails up here long enough, so hopefully you have everyone's contact information. Thank you again for joining us, and have an amazing rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.